I never get used to this. I'm used to being behind a monitor and then like with my headphones on, and then all of a sudden I take them off and I'm in front of you guys. So it's kind of, if I make any mistakes, so I'm a little nervous. I don't think the 5 coffees I had before this helps either. So have you ever thought about having a self-portrait done for yourself or having your own portrait done? Like, how would you choose to represent yourself? Like, what defines your best characteristics and how would you want to show them, basically? This is my self-portrait. For me, it's kind of like an introduction. I usually show this first because it's basically, this is who I am. A normal introduction would go something like, hi, I'm Ian Spriggs. I've been in the industry for 15 years. I've worked at companies like Oat Studios, Image Engine. I was born in England. Now I live in Vancouver, Canada. That's kind of a normal introduction, but it doesn't tell you who I am. I feel like this is basically who I am. I wanted to do a portrait which basically shows all my characters and like mood, personality. It's a little bit different than a digital double. Like the stuff I do for films is to create like a T-pose character where the animator or actor can add the life into it. A portrait is more about showing that life. And that's what kind of interests me. It shows the life of the person. So a lot of my inspirations comes from the old masters, like artists like Rembrandt. Like what I like about these paintings so much is Rembrandt lived hundreds of years ago, but you really can connect with this painting. It's like a subject where it's like he just pulls you in by the style of his work or by the lighting. You feel like you kind of know him, but he kind of tricks you into feeling like this is a real person, despite the fact it's just paint on canvas. Rembrandt he treated his artwork like it was an autobiography. He knew that his paintings showed more about who he was than basically like a written, like I went to this school and I lived here. He used them as like an autobiography of his life. He showed every moment from when he was a child to his older age. And you kind of know more about Rembrandt from looking at his paintings than if you read up on him. So basically, that's kind of what I was going to go for. I wanted to use the same techniques Rembrandt did and put that into my work. I wanted to show you who I am and show you my life. So basically, all the work I do is of my family, of people who have impacted my life, or people I love, or people who are important to me. I don't ever just go on Google and find like a random actor and decide I'm going to do this person, because I don't know them. That's not who I am. So everything I try and do is very personal. So all my portraits I take to heart. And what's pretty cool about the digital age is we get to be the first people who actually get to use new tools. Like Rembrandt used the paintbrush, but we're defining what the digital portraits are. It's a quick video. So usually I like to talk about my work in chronological order. I talk to my self-portrait, and then I did my brother second, then my sister-in-law. And I like to show that where I came from, and you can kind of see my progress. But I thought for this talk, it'd be just best to go straight into talking about Scott Eaton. This is one of my more recent pieces. If any of you don't know who Scott Eaton is, he's like an anatomy master. 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, when I first started the industry, I knew about Scott. Like, I learned some anatomy from him, and his passion towards anatomy really just got me realizing that he loves anatomy so much. It's like, maybe I could do something like this, and he drove me into doing character art. So what I like about anatomy is the fact that it deconstructs the human body into something from being very complicated into something very simple, and then it kind of rebuilds it back up. It deconstructs it in a way for you to understand. And portraits, kind of the same idea, but it's about the psychology. You try and break it down to stuff you understand and then rebuild it back up. Like, for example, to represent happiness. You can't show happiness, but you can only show representations of it, which might be a smile. So this idea, you can use them to break it down, figure out what it is you want to show up, and then build it back up. So also with anatomy, is that every single person has the same anatomy. Everyone's got a skeleton structure, muscles, a heart, a brain. We're all very identical, but not a single one of us is the same as anybody else. We're all unique. And that uniqueness is what I find super intriguing. And that's why I try and focus most of my work on, the differences between people, the differences between their physical representation, like the mind, their emotions, and what makes them different. So I met Scott 2 years ago at THU. And as soon as I met him, I was like, I wanted to do his portrait. Before I even actually introduced myself, I already knew I wanted to do his portrait. But I didn't want to be all nerdy and be like, Scott, I want to do your portrait. So I kind of just became friends. We got to know him a little bit, and then I asked if I could do his portrait. And he said he was honored. So we planned up a meeting up a year later, like the next THU, where I could take some photographs of him. But as soon as I asked him, I knew it had to be good. Scott Eaton was one of my idols, one of my heroes. So if I'm going to do a portrait of him, it's got to be one of my best ones. I'm going to quickly show you like an overview. I don't want to go too technical, because I'm not a technical guy like Chris mentioned. But I'm just going to go quick, like a brief tutorial, and basically show you my workflow. So this is basically how I start. I always have like a base mesh, which I can start all my portraits from. They basically all come from this, and I'll pose them, and then start from there. I usually would take a photo shoot of my subjects too. Usually I'll take like 200 photographs. I take as many as I can, because usually when I have access to a subject, they might be in a different city, so I'll take more than I need. When I take photos of them, I'll just like do the whole 360. It's almost like a scanning process. I basically take photos as if I was taking a scan of them. So by doing this photo shoot, I'll also take I have a light stick, which I'll try different poses of lights. So I'll get them to pose, move the light around, take different photos. And by the time I get the photos ready, I kind of know exactly where I want to go before I've started the portrait. And so once I know where I'm going to go, that's when I'll pose this guy into the pose of what I know what the portrait's going to be. I usually don't show the photographs anymore. I used to, but usually people like to do the A/B comparison, and then they just see the flaws, and rather than seeing like the magic of the portrait. So basically, I already know where this portrait's going to go. I'm just trying to untangle the knots until I get to it. So I like to work at Mudbox. ZBrush is awesome, but I think I've just used Mudbox for so long, I've got pretty used to it. So basically, I'll take something like this into Mudbox, start cleaning up the anatomy, start filling like the stuff I've learned from Scott, using that anatomy knowledge just to block in some of the shapes. Scott's probably looking at this and like, I didn't teach him that anatomy, it's awful. But I'm going to cover it up in a t-shirt and clothes, so it's going to be okay. So I work from large to small. Silhouette is one of the most important things, like getting the big forms and the shapes, and then I go small and small. Detail, for me, it's not that important. It's like a secondary thing. Having a good, like, the clothes feeling right, the shape, the pose feeling right, that's by far the most important thing. For the clothes, I just sculpt them by hand. I find marvelous designers amazing, but for me, I just like the actual control of making the fabric feel the way it's supposed to feel. Like the fabrics, you're supposed to be able to tell if it's a thick material or if it's a t-shirt material just by the way it's sculpted without textures. I had a couple of comments about Scott's veins after I finished his portrait. There was a little Twitter debate where people were saying his veins are way too big. And it was like a conversation, and then Scott jumped in and was like, nope, those are my veins. Thanks, Scott. So I try not to get too attached to anything either. There's sometimes I would model something, and I might spend like a couple of weeks modeling it, but if it doesn't support the portrait and the mood and the feeling of the piece I'm trying to get, I'll just get rid of it. Like the overall feeling is like the mood I'm trying to capture. If it doesn't suit the personality of them, even though I've spent hours and hours, days, weeks, I'll just absolutely just get rid of it. This video is a little longer than I expected. But yeah, Mudbox has got some good stuff for layers. It's got some pretty good tools which I use, but I use just the basic stuff. I never just go too complicated. I texture in Mudbox too. I'm not going to go too much into the texturing. I try to project what I can from the photographs I get. So obviously I've done like the 360, so I'll project what I can, but I'd say it's maybe like a 50-50, like 50% projection, 50% hand painted. Oops, I forgot to play. So yeah, I try and like paint what I can, project what I can. Diffuse map is probably the most important thing for me. I've reduced most of my maps to like 4 maps, so diffuse, spec, bump map, and gloss map. I don't usually use a subsurface map and all these other maps. For me, simplicity is the most important thing. So once I finish a Mudbox, I'll just take it back to Maya. I use the same camera angle. Well, Mudbox is really good because you can use the exact same camera you have in Maya into Mudbox. So when you start rendering, you know exactly what areas to fix in Mudbox. I started learning XGen. I did that for the last couple portraits. I usually only use 1 or 2 lights to begin with. A lot of people ask me what my lighting and rendering settings are. It's just go to V-Ray render settings, create light, render. I really believe in simplicity. There's a couple extra lights just for some of the extra speck on the eyes, but I always start off with just 1. Like the portrait of Sean I did, which you might have time later, I just used 1 light for the entire scene, and that was it. So for me, this is where the magic starts. The look dev. Everything before this is just basically, it's kind of a way, like you're working in the dark. You're working blind. So I've actually sped up my workflow because before I get to the look stage, I used to take all my models to like 90%, textures to 90%. Then I would add the look dev, then I render, and then I'll have to go back, change the model to fix it, change the textures. But now I just take the models to 50%, 40%, textures 40%, look dev, just quick shaders, and then I start rendering right away. So it gets to that point as quickly as possible, and then I only have to go back and change it a little bit less. I've actually saved about a month by doing that. My portraits used to take 3 months. Now I could probably get them done in like a month and a half, 2 months. So all my work has been done with V-Ray. This is using V-Ray Next. I keep all the most simple settings, like I said, with the lights, just create light. Even the shaders, it's not complicated. It's just the all-surface shader with those 4 maps. I don't go too complicated. When people say, what's my skin shader? It's just basic. It's like the most basic you could possibly go. V-Ray is amazing for out-of-the-box, straight-up renders. V-Ray Next has this amazing new hair shader, which I'm not going to go too far into it, but it's like you can control the amount of melanin and stuff like that with just like simple shaders. I used to do like pretty complicated shaders just to get like different hair colors going out. Now it's just simple, just 1 slider. I was told not to say melon before my talk because I was practicing the speech beforehand, and I kept on saying, and the melon in the hair. So it's melanin. So I've been pretty privileged and pretty lucky. V-Ray, Chris Nichols actually helped me. They introduced me to NVIDIA and Lenovo, and they provided me with a supercomputer, which is helping me do these renders. So so you guys know, I got 4 graphics cards. It's 3 Quadro P6000s and 1 Quadro P4000 with a Lenovo workstation. And it's been helping me create the last 2 portraits. Scott's was the first real portrait where I was able to work like this. Before, I would take iterations of my work and render each one out. Now it's just like I can do everything on the fly, whereas it's like I don't have to wait around for those renders to happen. It makes it a little bit difficult when you're trying to watch like Game of Thrones on the side. I used to do my render, watch my show, but now it's just like the renders are done so quickly. Okay, so some of the most important things for portraits: pose, lighting, and composition. Those are some of the most, not the most, maybe the top 3 most important. It's not just these 3, but these are the 3 things I think are really quite important. Pose is a really good way to express the subject, how they're feeling, like what they're trying to portray. You can kind of feel with Scott's portrait, he sat down, he's leaning into you. He's not stood up, over-towering you, looking down on you. He's just sat there, leaning in. He's got a firm grasp of his skull. Is this playing? Oops. But anyway, he's got a firm grasp of his skull. So he's almost like he's in control of his career. Scott teaches anatomy, and I feel like the fact that he's holding his skull, he's taking control of over his career pretty much. And he sat down, leaning into you. He's almost like a teacher. So that's kind of like, I thought it was a good way to show the pose, helping show you who Scott is. Lighting is another great example of how to use tools like the lighting to show a subject. This piece was done by Caravaggio. It's David holding the head of Goliath. It's very strong, hard lighting. You feel like there's a lot of tension and a little bit of aggression behind it, which it was. Like there's just, David just killed Goliath. And a little interesting fact, this head is actually very similar to what Caravaggio looks like. Maybe a year before this, Caravaggio murdered somebody. So I feel like he kind of painted this because of the guilt he was feeling. So you feel a lot of tension from this type of lighting. Rembrandt on the right is Aristotle holding the head of Homer. It's 2 people holding the heads, but this one feels a lot more softer, a lot more gentle. It's more introspective. So that's a good way how like lighting can really change the mood of a piece. And composition. You want to be able to control where the viewer looks. You don't want the eyes wandering off. For me, I wanted to have you looking at Scott because he's looking at you. And then your eyes go down to the skull. The skull's looking back at him, so you kind of look back up. And it's kind of like this, you're kind of stuck in a loop. You're not going to wander off. I'm trying to keep your attention on my work of Scott. One of the most important props I think I've ever done in any of my portraits, the skull. Like what it was represented in history, it's kind of like basically sort of remind us of our life, remind us that we're going to die. It basically shows the life of us. So I did a little bit of research about it before I started it. I went through a couple of history paintings and like seeing what has been done before and what they were doing with the skull. And I've noticed one thing about most skulls. Every single one of them is almost like it's being presented to you. Like you can tell this one's almost like, look at the skull. It's a reminder of your life. Don't forget, like you're going to die one day. It's basically everything's presented to you. But Scott, I originally had his skull facing you, like to reflect you. But the composition didn't work, so I flipped it up to face himself. And that's the moment when I realized that this skull is not reflecting the viewer, it's reflecting himself. And in doing so, that means I thought it would be a good idea to make the skull actually Scott's skull. So I actually did a whole bunch of research. I went online and found research papers on the tissue depth of the face to figure out the actual shape of his skull. So once I got all the data, I put the skull in it. Well, because I already had the shape of Scott's skull, or Scott's head from the photographs I'd taken, and I was pretty sure that was pretty accurate. So once I had the model of him done, I could put the skull on him, calculate the depth of his skull. And so it's actually a pretty accurate representation of his skull. So he can actually be holding his own skull in his hands, which is kind of cool because it's something you actually can't do. Or I hope you can't do. This is one of my most recent portraits. This is a portrait of my aunt, Jen. I've wanted to do portraits of all my family members, but it's like, because I was living in England, my parents, my brothers, we all moved to Canada when I was young. I was about 13. And so the rest of my family stayed in England, so I don't get to see Jen that often. She comes every once in a while, but when she came for a visit, I was like, I'm doing your portrait, so I took all the photos I needed. So one of the biggest challenges in digital humans is like the Uncanny Valley. We have all this idea that we know what makes a human a human. We have all the variables that we know. Like this correct skin shade, correct hair. And that list is growing. The more we know about digital humans, we can add to that list. But a lot of what makes us human is subconscious. We don't really see the blood pulsating through our face. We have cameras now where you can actually see the blood pulsating. There's micro movements of the eye. But then once you add that into it, that becomes a constant variable. But then there's more subconscious things. So it's like, how do you know how to add those subconscious things into your work? One reason I do people I know and not random people off of Google or people I don't do too many commissions, because I like to do people I know because I know who they are. And if it's not incorrect, my subconscious mind will tell me that's not correct. So I can keep on working on it until my subconscious mind says that's about right. So it's kind of like I'm getting my subconscious mind to work for me. Jen was extremely difficult for that because I remember her when I was about this big, very vividly. Now, years later, she's obviously grown or aged, and she looks a little bit different. So it's like I was torn between how I saw her when I was a kid versus how I am right now. I even showed my dad, this is my dad's sister, and he even said, no, that's not Jen. She should have long brown hair, she's a lot younger. It's like, no, Dad, this is actually her. There's the photographs. So I thought that was kind of it made a difficult portrait to do. I think another hard thing when it comes to overcoming the Uncanny Valley is that even though technology, we can't do digital portraits without technology, if technology is visible in the work will become dated. I would say digital art is one of the only pieces of artwork which has an expiry date. If you look back at my self-portrait, the artistic might be okay, but it actually is expired. I don't think it's as good. If I released it now, I don't think anybody would care for it too much. It's kind of too old. So I think even though we work with technology and we can't do it without, we kind of need to hide as much as we can. We want to be able to look back in 100 years and have no idea when the piece was made, have no idea what program it was used to make it. We just see the art for itself. And that's one of my goals, to try and do that. So I'd actually like to go back and revisit my own self-portrait and see how much the technology has advanced, and see how much of myself as an artist has improved. And see, even I've aged a little bit, so even as a human being, I've changed. to the portrait of Erika. So a lot of portraits, or like a lot of portraits in history, like they usually wear like the best clothes. They're kind of like used to show off in a way, so to show off like wealth and status. For Erika, I had her with the same like mentality. I wanted to show her like kind of a showing off, like a fashion. She's got high fashion sense, like the ripped jeans are more of a fashion thing. She's wearing gold jewelry, gold necklace. It's about like the possessions. And when I asked her to do a portrait, she was like, I'll let you do my portrait, but you have to include my dog. No dog, no portrait. I was like, I've never done a dog. I don't want to do it. Just like, no portrait then. So I reluctantly agreed to include her dog, Carmine, into it. But once I agreed to it, I realized that's who she is. Like when I asked you, it's like, what would you include in your portrait? Erika decided that her choice, like what makes her her is her dog. Like she doesn't see herself without it. And I think because it was so important to her, it shows that she has that she can love something so much that it actually becomes who she is. And I was like, I have to include Idaga at this point. So there he is, Carmine. A little breakdown. So Erika's portrait was inspired by Hans Holbein's The Ambassador's painting. This painting is all about possessions. You can tell by they're dressed in their best clothes. The objects on the table are very like fancy. But this guy, he's a scientist. He's got like a telescope in his hands, and he's more of like a religious priest maybe. But it's kind of like they're showing their profession by the clothes, the items on the table. If you can see it from a science point of view, it's like astronomy, books, music, and then at the bottom of the thing here, you can see a skull, elongated skull. So that's kind of death. But you can see it from the religious point of view too, heaven, earth, and hell. And so in this piece, I thought, like, the skull is pretty cool, because no matter what you believe, it's like death is going to come to us all. So I thought that was a kind of a cool thing. It's like, even though we have possessions and they show who we are, we're all going to die at one point. It's also, I think a skull also represents like our life too, so it's also a positive thing to it, a positive thing to add. So I added it to Erika's earring. So what's cool about this piece, so you've got the skull, so Hans Holbein is saying, yes, death comes to us all. He doesn't necessarily think that's it, that's the end of the story. If you look up on the top left-hand side, you'll see a cross. So even though he believes that death is the end, it's not like, death happens, it's not the end. So my interpretation of this were the V-Ray render buckets. So I don't know, maybe we can immortalize ourselves through our artwork. Maybe our artwork can live on, or we can digitalize ourselves through the digital human. 10 minutes? Hey, Chris, can you just let me know when 5 minutes is up? Can you just let me know at the 5 minutes? Okay. So I worked with Neil Blomkamp for a little bit. I worked with him at Oat Studios. I asked to do his portraits. Once I started working with him and realizing how cool of a director he is, he was very focused and like very inspiring. So for Neil's portrait, I wanted to do something a little bit similar to the strong lighting Caravaggio did. Like Neil is very, like, he knows what he wants, he's creative, he's the director. So I wanted to use the same lighting, like he's strong, he knows where he's going. It's very, it's not tension, but the strength going forward. And for Neil's portrait, I also wanted to include his hands in front and center of the piece. Hands are one of the things which people forget about. Personally, I think hands are almost more important than the face. People can like lie in the face. You can sometimes not read their emotions. Hands will always tell the truth. And also, if you have hands in a painting, like back in the Renaissance paintings, if you have two hands, it actually costs more money to make. So you're more wealthy, because it's more of a status to show off. One hand, you're relatively wealthy. No hands, you can't afford it. So with Neil being a top director, I wanted to have two hands in the painting, or the portrait. Like you can see by these hands, like the despair in them. They tell the story. This artist believed that the hands were more expressive than the face, so he just covers up the face. Once you start seeing the hands, how valuable they are, as a digital artist, you have to make sure you focus on them as much as you do on the face. You can tell the death of Marat. You can tell the hand is dead. The hand of David, you can feel the strength behind it. The soft gentleness of the Mona Lisa's hands. There's even the story. You know that there's a very powerful touch between these two fingers. It tells a very strong story. Portrait of Tony. I've been friends with Tony for about 20 years. He's one of my oldest friends. When we hung out, he came to visit. I said, Tony, I want to do your portrait a little bit like this. Gustave Courbet's painting. I try to pose him like this. I'm like, Tony, pose like this. And I'm like, no, you're not doing it right. And after a while, he got kind of lazy, and it's just like, how's this? Like, he went natural, and I took the photos like this. And it works a lot better, because it's more natural, it's more who he is. I feel like when I do a photo shoot, I shouldn't be controlling who they are, because that's almost like me putting myself in their shoes and telling them who to be. In a way, I need to have like a candid camera and then take photos of them. That's why I don't usually do people smiling, because when you take a photo shoot of them, it's almost like a fake smile, and it's like I've not been able to capture that yet. Does anybody want to guess what Tony's profession is? What his job is? Anybody? Lawyer? He's a high school math teacher. I remember my high school math teacher, like the dorky glasses, tie. Tony uses clothes as a way to express himself. If you see Tony go to a football game, he's the one dressed up. His Halloween costumes always win everything. He uses clothes to express who he is. So his clothes in his portrait are the way he wore them, because it expresses his personality. Kind of, if you think of like a policeman or a doctor, they have a uniform which takes on an identity of who they are, and we kind of respect that. Tony uses the same mentality to express who he is. So the portrait of Sean I did, I was very interested. Sean, 5 minutes. Okay, we're going to got 5 minutes left. I actually want to go forward and show you something else. Sorry, I'm going to skip through these a little bit. Okay. So one of the questions I get a lot is, how do people react when they see a piece? Like when my mom saw her piece for the first time, she started crying, because she's like, I look so miserable, I'm a lot happier than that. My sister-in-law was like, that's not who I look like. You didn't represent myself well enough. But it's like some people absolutely love it. You guys are actually going to witness firsthand how someone's going to react. So there's Andre here. Andre, I finished your self-portrait. So if everybody could please look at Andre. It's a portrait of Andre. Everyone knows Andre runs THU, but Chris introduced me to Andre, and Andre was the first person to ever put me on stage. So I have to, I have to put the spotlight back on Andre for a little bit. But I don't feel like I could be stood here without getting the confidence that Andre put on me to be able to present. It's been like really good. I feel like sometimes, even though I'm stood up on stage by myself, I don't feel like these are entirely my own portraits. I've been helped so much from like Vire, Lenovo, NVIDIA, like Andre and THU, Total Chaos for bringing me here. I feel like I'm like, the support of this community is like no other industry. We feel like we might be alone sometimes, but the community is so loving and caring that everybody's always here for you. So one of the reasons I did Andre's portrait is because I felt like Andre did a lot for me, so I wanted to give back to Andre. The gray version. Once again, I actually forgot to put your tattoo on this one, but it was in the actual portrait. But yeah, I would really like to thank Total Chaos for bringing me here today. It's been a crazy experience. I absolutely love it. And thank you all for showing up here to see my talk as well.